Okay, so welcome back to this pro-seminar, the introductory seminar of biological basis of experience and behavior, so focusing on decision neuroscience. So today is the fourth lecture, the lecture 4, and it's been a while since we have discussed something from the last time. And the last time we had two sessions, a joint session. So the first one we talked about experimental design. We talked about variables, dependent variable, independent variable. So we talked about randomization. We talked about manipulation check. We talked about within subject design. We talked about between subject design, right? So everything related to experimental design. It didn't mean to be a complete introductory course, because it can be an entire semester talking about the same topic. With respect to the experimental design. It's more that I just show you what is the relevant concept that can be important to remember as a student from the departments of psychology, the faculty of psychology, as a bachelor student in this field. So then we moved also on to the next topic, focusing on the research methods in decision neuroscience. So we talked about, from the very beginning, behavior measurements. So behavior is quite important because we could see behavior as a window, right, to understand what can be going on, what might be going on in the brain when participants are doing some decisions. And we measure we measure the choices, like if we give participants multiple choices and we just measure which one they choose, which one they pick from all those possible alternatives. We could also measure related response time. So from they see the option until they make a response, how long did it take for the participants? So this is the time. So if something, if you do like apple, for example, if I show you an apple and you might immediately want to have it. And for some other people, if you do not really like apple, you like orange. But if I give you an apple and I say, just do you want to have an apple? And suppose you do not really like it, and you might be a little bit hesitant to really take the apple from me, even though it's free, right? So then this reaction time is a little bit longer than people who really like apple relative to other fruits. So in this example. And relatedly, we could also measure eye tracking. So we show something on the screen, and then we could measure how their eye gaze movement pattern look like, and also the fixation. So if there is a face in front of the participants, and then we could measure how long does the participant spend on looking at the eyes of the facial stimuli, and how much time the participant spends on looking at the nose, for example. Because, you know, eyes and the nose and mouth, and also the relative location or relative position of all these facial components, parts, is important to be able to recognize the emotion of the stimuli that they have seen from the computer. Okay, good. And we could also measure something else, which is so-called the mouse tracking. So we show participants something in front of this computer, and then we let the participants to move the mouse. We let participants move the mouse to go to the target place. So suppose the same idea as we talked about always. So there is a chocolate brownie, top left corner, and then there is a greenish cucumber smoothie, top right corner. And then the starting point is the middle point of the bottom line. And then starting from the bottom, moving the mouse towards either of the two choice options is a way to measure their willingness to approach the targets. So if they really want to have the brownie, maybe go from the bottom straight line to the top left corner to the brownie. But maybe if there's some hesitance going on around the thinking of the participants, and then maybe the curve is a little bit curved. So the trace is a little bit curved with a bit curvature rather than a straight line from the bottom to the top left target. And we could also measure some physiological responses. We could measure the facial EMG, we could measure the heart rates, we could also measure the skin conductance. So this is quite frequently used in the literature, not only decision science, decision neuroscience, but also in psychology in general. So we use the SCR as the index of the arousal level, for example, or threatening, like the preparation of being threatened of the participants. We also then moved to the real kind of neuroimaging technology. So we talked about the EEG and the MEG. So we put the EEG and MEG together because they are similar, but they are also different. Similar in the sense that they have high temporal resolution, a relatively low spatial resolution. And what they measure is that the EEG measures the current, like the small electronic responses generated from the brain, from the neuronal activity. And then the MEG measures the small magnetic field generated by the same biological findings. So this electronic activity. So they measure different aspects of the thing, of the similar thing. And then we moved to the fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging. So this is the MRI machine, and it has a relatively lower temporal resolution, but it has high spatial resolution in terms of this of millimeters. Okay, so the voxel level is the resolution of the spatial mapping of the brain. So voxel, if you forgot what that means, so pixel is the small elements of a 2D picture, and the voxel is like a 3D pixel. It's like a small cube, and we use that to we measure the neuronal activities within this small 3D cube. And then what is quite important to understand is that the fMRI does not directly measure the brain activity. So instead, it measures something called a Bold signal. So it is the blood dependence response. So the idea is that the underlying assumption is that if a certain brain area is more activated than others, then more oxygen is to be consumed. So more oxygen is needed relative to when this area is not active, right? So if there are more oxygen around, so that means more oxygen is available to be consumed. So then in this case, this area is more activated. We also talked about a few other techniques. So we actually also talked about the single neuron recording, usually done with animals. So if we could do some operation, we plug in a electrode, and then we could record some neuronal activities from the cortex of monkey or mice, for example. This is a direct recording. It really records the neuronal activity. And there's something else called the lesion study. So lesion study is that we might, even though they're very rare, but it's possible that we find them. So some patients, they may have bilateral amygdala damage. So then that basically means they do not have amygdala, roughly speaking. So then their behavior might be different than relative to normal people, healthy people. In the example we saw, so they differ in terms of recognizing emotions, especially negative emotions. So emotions with negative valence, like angry, like afraid, for example, not happy. So that's a positive valence emotion. And we also talked about non-invasive brain stimulation technique. We talked about TMS, we talked about TDCS. So these two, both of the two techniques, so if you target the brain area, so both of the two techniques, they temporarily disrupt the activation of the brain area. It's like a virtual lesion. So nowhere of the brain is lesioned, but temporarily by receiving this electronic or magnetic stimulation, this area, the activity of this target area is temporarily lesioned, like virtually. So in this case, we could study if downregulating or disrupting a certain area could could lead to some behavioral change. And if it does, we could say, well, this area can be the cause of the behavioral change. So there is a way to establish a causal relationship or causal link between the brain area and behavior. Okay. So we have a bigger picture in terms of, on the x-axis, the spatial resolution, and on the y-axis, the timing, the temporal resolution, or maybe the other way around, but doesn't matter. So one dimension is spatial resolution, the other dimension is the temporal resolution, and we just map different neuroimaging techniques on top of the screen, on top of this plot. So then if you recall that some techniques is good at spatial resolution, but not good at temporal resolution. For example, the fMRI, but some others, I talked about EEG and MEG, they have better, relatively good temporal resolution, but not really a good spatial resolution. Okay, so MEG actually has a quite pretty decent spatial resolution. So that's pretty much what we have discussed from the last time, and then from this week on, we will really switch gear towards the presentations, because as I said at the very beginning, this is an introductory seminar. So I show you quite a few introductory materials, and then students, so you as the learner, as the real person, as the real people who is doing the learning, you will read papers and then to present papers. So this presenting thing will be a little bit challenging. So it challenges at least 3 of the skills you have. So one is to read, right? To summarize what is the main point, the main topic, main method, main result of the paper you are about to present. And the second one is about to present. So even though understanding is the crucial part, but presenting it well to people who are not so familiar with this topic is quite challenging. So to explain complex things using relatively easier fashion or language is also quite important. Not only for science, if you in the future after graduation you do something else, doesn't matter. But this skill is crucial, right? You explain something, especially something complex, using relatively easier language. So imagine just you explain things to your parents, to your grandmother, to your neighbor, right? To your newspaper delivery person, something like this. And then the third kind of aspect that can be a little bit challenging is the way to take questions and the way to take responses. So I will show you again to have a brief introductory, because you know this already, but to have a brief recap. So what is going on during this presentation. So after you present this paper, and then you will receive questions, right? You will receive questions either from me or from the other peer students. And then the way to handle the questions is also quite important. Okay, good. So all of the skills, they are kind of soft skills in the sense that it doesn't have to be decision neuroscience. It could be affective neuroscience. It also could be not neuroscience at all. It can be just animal behavior. It can be also interesting, or clinical psychology. So everything related to psychology, or even something else, biology, right? So these soft skills can be transferred. So they are transferable skills. And then I believe all of them are quite important for you as a person for some career development. Okay, cool. So we get started. So if you don't have to worry if the screen freezed because I didn't move anything actually. So now decision neuroscience warm up, I did it for you. So I hope that you followed my free talking kind of to imagine, to recall what we have discussed from the last time. And so from today on, we will have the topic specific seminars. And recall that at the beginning we said there will be 4 main topics, and then the 4 main topics will be the topic that you will be based on for the midterm paper and also for the final group project. So the 4 main projects are the value-based decision-making / consumer neuroscience, and then the second one is risky decision-making and intertemporal decision-making. third one is motivation and emotion in decision making. The last one is social decision making. And about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I set up a group pool on Moodle so that you could sign up your interest to one of the 4 topics. So because we have 40 people and we have 4 topics, that means each topic will be repeated twice, okay? So we have 2 groups here and 2 groups here and so on and so forth. And if you look at the results, here this is full, seems like people are interested in this one, social decision making. Here is also full, here is nearly full, and there's one more free space. And then what is, well, a little bit surprising is that there is not too many people, only one so far is interested in value-based decision making. And even though there are people who will be presenting this topic, but it doesn't really interest the people. Okay, so I have 2 things to say here. So one is that if you haven't done so, please sign up here to the Moodle. On Moodle, you have the chance to sign up your interest in the pool. And the second thought I have is that given there is not much yet interest in these 2 topics, so I might have a third group for motivation and emotion in decision making, and a third group for social decision making. Okay, so now I want to ask you, especially for those of you who haven't registered. So if you have done this, you don't have to respond to me. So especially for those of people who have not yet registered, send up your interest. So tell me, do you want to do value-based decision making, or you want to do either motivation or social decision making? So you can tell me in the chat box so that you make an informed decision. Okay, I see 2 motivation and social. Good, good. Okay, who else? If you haven't said so, then. So there are 10 people haven't yet registered. Send up your interest. If I do not really receive 10 responses now, I will make the decision for you. Judging from the response, I guess it's fine. So I will have a third group for this, motivation and emotion, and we will have a third group for social decision making. Okay, so I will open the sign up later today, and I will remove these 2 groups. And for this person, I don't know who you are, so if you are signed up here, but I guess you will not have teammates, so then maybe move somewhere down here or here. I mean the third group. Okay, make sense? Everyone's happy? Good. Nice. Okay, so then we go to move to the topic. So remember the structure of the lecture. So each seminar from this week on, so we will have 3 presentations, and each presentation will take up about 20 minutes, so in total 1 hour. And before that is my part. So I have a general picture of introduction of the topic. So in this case, I will briefly talk to you about value-based decision making, and then we will listen to presentations from our paired presenters. Good. Okay, so value-based decision making. I will go back again to this example because this is a quite nice illustration of a value-based decision making. So before I talk to you a little bit detail, actually, I will give you a little bit more theoretical backgrounds. So there are research teams. So from a few years ago, it's actually more than 10 years ago. So they proposed a framework for studying the neurobiology of value-based decision-making, right? It fits quite well, very well to the general overarching topic of our pro seminar, this introductory seminar. So in this paper, they basically proposed a framework. So the framework goes this way. They proposed a multi-step decision-making framework. So they decompose decompose decision-making into several steps or several stages. So it's, if you follow me, so this picture or this framework, the workflow, it goes from here. So the representation, what does that mean? So if I am giving you two choices, brownie and smoothie, so you are a person who have to make the choice. So then you have to represent the problem. So the problem is a generic term. So basically something you have to solve, right? If I give you two options, you don't have to make a decision. So this is the action you're supposed to take. You're supposed to take one out of the two options. So you have to represent the problem and then you solve it. So this is the representation part. And then the second step is to have a valuation stage. Valuation here, then that means if I give you the two options in front of you, then you will have to imagine or to evaluate, or maybe do some mental calculation, which one is more valuable to you. And of course, I discussed something called a goal, right? You have to keep your goal in mind. Do you want to just treat yourself, or do you just want to keep a more healthy diet? So given you have a goal already, let's say we want to keep a diet, and given this goal, and under this goal, this is the condition. Given this condition, what is more valuable out of these two? So is the smoothie more valuable, or is the brownie more valuable, given that you want to keep a healthy diet? So then you have to evaluate which one is more valuable, which one is not. Okay, so this is the valuation part. You basically ask yourself, is it worth it? So this is the question. And then the third part is the action selection. So I give you two choices. You think, you evaluate which one is more valuable, which one is not. And then maybe you just take the one with the higher value, and then you choose, you want to just maximize the value you have. So if the goal is to keep a healthy diet, and then it gives you these two options, and then not so surprisingly, the smoothie will be very likely to have a higher value, and then you just take the smoothie. Okay. So then this three is so far enough to describe simple situations, simple decision-making situations. It can be a little bit more complicated. So it depends on the choice. There can also be outcome. So in a simple scenario, I give you two choices. You do something in your mind, and then you make a choice. That's it. That's already finished. This decision-making problem is already finished. But then in some other cases, let's say you drink the smoothie, and then it doesn't taste well. It's so sour, and it doesn't taste very coherent, the texture, the liquid. So then this outcome can be quite negative, right? Negative basically means you do not want to have it anymore. And then you learn from your experience. You learn that, okay, even though I want to keep a healthy diet, even though the smoothie looks good, but doesn't taste good. And from the negative outcome I learned, and then I might have a lower value of the smoothie. So I devaluate the smoothie. So here I might devaluate it. So then I use the new value I learned from the outcome, and then I make a further choice. So maybe I give you this smoothie versus the brownie. You take the smoothie, and then it doesn't taste good. And then there's some other guy, and he or she give you a smoothie again using this devalued evaluation. After learning, you might not choose the smoothie. You might rather choose the brownie, even though your goal is to keep a healthy diet. Okay, good. So this is kind of the framework. And today, when we are talking about value-based decision-making, we are mainly talking about here, this part, as example I showed. So here's the valuation stage or valuation step. Okay. Yeah, and then there's a question. It asks, does this always happen 100% consciously? So here, it's not so easy to answer, I guess, because there's some habitual aspects involved. So let's say if you are a person, you have never tasted a brownie, so you just basically always taste smoothie and smoothie. Maybe sometimes it doesn't taste good, sometimes it does, but it becomes a habit, okay? So then in this case, it doesn't really rely on too much the value. So it more relies on your habit, your habitual behavior. Yeah. good. And another quite important term or concept related to value-based decision making is called utility. So utility is more or less a value. Okay, there's some slight difference. I can show you why or how. So again, the same example, one is brownie, the other one is smoothie, and you have to make a choice between the two. So in decision science or decision theories, utility is a measure of the desirability of consequences of action. So you can map what I've said in this sentence to the framework we have described already. So what that means, and that means basically valuation, right? So there's something kind of a rule of maximization. You choose the alternative with the highest utility. So in that framework, you represent what you are about to solve, and then you do the evaluation, and then you do this action selection. You make a choice based on your value, based on which one has a higher subjective value or utility out of your choice alternatives. So what is quite important here, also quite interesting to remember, is that utility here is not objective. So it's quite a subjective feeling or subjective valuation. So it's easier to understand actually. So some people, the same smoothie, some people they like it, some people they do not like it. So it's quite a subjective feeling, right, towards the same thing. So one example, it can be that let's assume the brownie worth €1, the smoothie worth €2. This doesn't necessarily mean the utility. So if this utility, if your subjective feeling or subjective value of the brownie is higher than the subjective value of the smoothie, maybe you take this. But on the other hand, even though you see here, the value, the actual monetary cost of this one is higher than this. But even though this is maybe the objective case, here it's worth more than this, but your subjective evaluation is this one higher than this. So then you choose this one, okay? So basically what I wanted to emphasize is that utility or value is quite a subjective thing. So in literature, if you read economics, then they use utility a lot. So they say utility this, utility that. But maybe in psychological research, you'll see the term that is called subjective value more often relative to utility. And there are people, they kind of interchange these two terms, utility, subjective value. So slight difference maybe, I don't have to worry about that, but usually they mean the same thing. So same thing in the sense that the subjectiveness is the key, is crucial. Okay, good. So we have the framework I talked about already a few times. So then, so value is a objective measure, and we are talking about subjective value, right? That's the subjective part, subjectivity, subjectiveness. So utility is a measure of the desirability of the consequences of an action, I told you. So from a neurobiological perspective, an object has a subjective value if it is a reward or punishment. So imagine there is a line on the x-axis. Let's say this is x-axis, some x-axis on the coordinates, just x-axis. Don't worry about the y-axis. So the x-axis is the subjective value. It means it can be high, it can be low, right? So this is the valence of the subjective value. So at the one end, maybe the right-hand side, that means reward. So the larger the subjective value, the larger the utility. So the larger the subjective value you will have. So reward. And at the lower end, the left-hand side, so then that might mean punishments. So then the larger the value, negative value, the larger the punishment. Okay. So basically, there's a line. One end is reward, the other one is punishment. It's continuous, and we are talking about the valence. It can be positive, it can be negative. Okay. And from a little bit from a evolutionary perspective. So the value is something that's an animal or a person who we work on. So in the sense that people or animal or any kind of organ, so they will try to approach the reward. If there's something that has a high subjective value, I just want to get it, okay? So a reward is something for agents who will work to approach. And therefore the negative, the opposite valence, the negative part, the punishment, is something that the agent doesn't want to have. So if I know this has a negative valence, a negative subjective value, negative utility, I don't want to have it. Rather, I want to escape from it. I want to avoid it, okay? So it's a little bit from this evolutionary perspective. If there's a reward, I want to approach it. If there's a punishment, I want to avoid it, okay? As simple as that. So there's also from some animal literature, there's some interesting animal behavior you can also see from by clicking this link. Good. And a side note, so speaking about behavior, recall what we talked about from the last time. Behavior matters, right? Quite important. Behavior is quite important to understand what might be going on. That's the window to look at the brain. Cool. So before the presentations, so I tell you a little bit more about the paradigm. Paradigm means experimental tasks. So what kind of task we use, we show, we present to the participants so that we can measure how they value each choice option, how they value each stimuli, choice alternative. So this is kind of typical, but not the most simple, the simplest task. So the simplest task, you can imagine, I show you an orange, I say yes or no. So do you want it or not? So this is the most, the simplest task that you could imagine. But here, this one is a little bit complex, not too much. So it has another layer, it has another component. That means the effort. So I can show you how that works. This is the choice you have. So you either want to have it or not. But if you do want to have it, you will have to recall that we have something called a squeeze bar, the denominator. So if you want to have it, you have to squeeze the squeeze bar, the denominator, so that your force will increase and then reach a certain threshold. And only when your effort, so this measures effort, right? So only when your effort reaches the threshold and stays there for maybe 2 seconds, then you can get the orange. If not, then you cannot get the orange. So then this measures your how much willingness you have to, you would like to give, you would like to invest to get this object. If orange means a lot to you, even though this energy threshold is high, you still want to try as hard as you can so that you can get it orange. And in another scenario, if orange doesn't mean anything to you, so if you do not like it, even though maybe in another case, the scenario, the threshold is here. Even though the threshold is not high, you still do not want to spend any energy on that. You just don't like orange. You do not want to spend, take the effort to retrieve, to obtain the choice, the fruit. Okay. So then we could try to make some association between how likely you would like to choose orange as a function of the internal or subjective value, okay? So again, the last time when we were talking about reading graphs, so what is the important thing to look at? The first thing to look at is always the axis. What does the x-axis represent and what does the y-axis represent? So here the x-axis represents the stimulus value. So this is the subjective rating or subjective value. So there's something I didn't tell you. So before this experiment, usually experimenters just show participants this orange and also some other objects repeatedly, maybe once or twice, and ask them on a scale rating, for example, between 1 to 9. So how much do you like it, okay? So then for people who rate the orange are high, maybe 8 out of 9. So for them is maybe this, let's say this is standardized, okay? Let's say 8 out of 9 is here. And then these people will be more likely to choose the orange. Choose basically means I want to have it because orange means a lot to them. They like it. they rate it 8 out of 9. There are some other people, let's say they do not like orange, so they rate orange maybe 1 out of 9 or 0 out of 9. So in this case, if we plot it, they are here on the x-axis. So then their behavior is usually they are not willing to obtain the orange. So they do not want to. They do not want it. They choose no in this case. So you could just imagine, as long as the subjective value increases, participants are more likely to choose to accept this offer rather than reject it. And there's another component, as I said to you, there is something called effort, okay? So similarly, likewise here, this graph, look at the x-axis. Here the x-axis means the effort. So how much they have to exert to obtain the fruits. You see here, this shape is entirely the opposite, but actually makes sense, right? So the more effort I have to put, the less likely I will then choose to accept this orange. So here, if I have to put the maximum effort to obtain an orange, maybe I do not want to do it. But if I do not have to put a lot of effort, then I can get it, maybe I will choose it, okay? So this is a way to demonstrate how the choice probability is changed, is affected as the subjective evaluation, subjective rating, subjective value, utility, similar thing. And also as a function of the effort, how much you have to spend, right, to invest to get it, okay? Cool. And because we are talking about decision neuroscience, and we will talk a little bit about the brain part, and we will leave the other parts to the presentations. So if we are talking about value, so if something has a higher value versus if something has a lower value, where in the brain responds accordingly, in the sense that when the subjective value is high, then somewhere in the brain, the activation is also high. And if the subjective value is low, then the same place in the brain, the activation is low. So you see this correspondence. When the value is high, the brain activation is high. When the value is low, the brain activation is low. So where in the brain shows this kind of pattern, right? And this is interesting study, kind of, and researchers started this kind of research from quite a few years ago. And up to the point of 2013 here, there are already tons of studies, experiments looking at this effect. And so these people, if you're interested, look at this paper. So they did a meta-analysis. So they did not collect data from participants. They collect papers from the library, from the online searching engine, from Google Scholar, for example. And then they take the papers who looked at this kind of pattern, and then they analyzed the shared part. What is the similarity? What is similar across all these different studies? What is the common area that responds to the value? Okay, so this is the meta-analysis. So they look at tons of hundreds of experiments. They are all different, but they look at the similar thing. They look at which is the neural correlates of value. And then they are trying to extract the commonality among those a few hundred papers. So what they found is quite interesting, is that they report two important regions. So one is called the ventral median prefrontal cortex, also short as VMPFC. So this one is the area I talked about. So when the subjective value is high, this activation in VMPFC is high. So when the subjective value is low, the activation of VMPFC is low, okay? And they also report another brain area, which is the subcortical region in the midbrain. So it's called nucleus accumbens, short as NACC. This shows somehow the similar pattern, okay, related to value. The nucleus accumbens is also related to something called a reward prediction error, and this is something for later, not for today, okay? And then if you recall here, we have the stages thing, and what are the brain regions that are relatively related to each stage? So stage 1 here, valuation, here, valuation, stage 2, choice, is here, choice, and then outcome, and then learning, right? Outcome here, this one. So they show some correspondence. You also see that, well, there's VMPFC, and striatum is also like the nucleus accumbens. So striatum is the larger area, and the nucleus accumbens is the sub area of striatum brain activities. And relatedly, there are something somewhere else related to here, the valuation parts, but this is a little bit too much for today. Okay. Quite important to know, and this figure actually is taken from the book, The Neuroeconomics. So everything I told you so far is from a little bit not recent. So they're important studies, of course, but there are some new, more recent findings. So here, 2013, there is a much broader view or review from 3 years ago. So they also reviewed brain areas that are related to integration. So maybe you have different sources of information, you want to integrate it. And here there's value. So this is the important part we want to look at, okay? The value part in purple. So in fact, we see quite a few different regions. So here again, we see here the VMPFC, here's the VMPFC. So the ventral striatum is more or less the nucleus accumbens. So out of all different studies, up until 2013, up until 2017, you always see these two areas. So these two areas are quite important for us to understand at this bachelor level at least. So VMPFC, again, ventral median, prefrontal cortex, and ventral striatum / nucleus accumbens, okay? I think I did my part pretty long, so let's move on to the paired presentation. But before that, any questions regarding this introduction of value-based decision-making? And for a few of you, if you haven't registered, you can still change your mind. Instead of doing emotion, you can still work on value-based decision-making. No, I'm kidding. So questions? There's a question, what does in the circle, model-based in green, and the model-free in, what is this color? Orange, let's say orange here, what this means. This is a little bit complex topics to talk about. So let me try to summarize. This challenges my ability to explain complex things in easier language. So when we make decisions, we could try to imagine there's something called habitual, right? That's the idea I talked about. Thanks to that question. So habitual is that it's a no-brainer kind of, and I do not have to use my brain, I just rely on my habits to make a decision. But doesn't mean the habitual behavior will always result in a positive outcome. So I just do it all the time, but it doesn't necessarily mean this action will lead to a positive outcome. So this is the idea, but it's focused more on the habitual part. And relative to habitual behavior, there's something called goal-directed behavior. So you act accordingly to the goal you achieve. So if you do something, it gives you a positive feedback. You might do it more often because you want to obtain again more frequently the positive outcome. And if you do something, you get a negative feedback. So you get punished, for example, then you want to avoid it. You do not want to do it anymore because it gives you a negative feedback. So then this is called goal-directed. And here you see these two differences. So one is habitual, the other one is goal-directed. And habitual and goal-directed learning or decision-making can be roughly mapped to model-free and model-based. So model-free basically means you do not really have to have a complex representation of the world. You just behave like habitually. And then here, there's the meaning of model-free. So roughly speaking, not so precise. So that basically means no-brainer. You do not have to rely on too much mental calculation, computation. You just do whatever you like as you did already from your experience, from your behavior history, so habitual. So model-based, on the other hand, means there is a relatively dedicated and a comprehensive and a little bit maybe complex structure in your mind to represent what might be going on in the world. So you have a model. The model is linked to, is it here? Not here. Here, yeah, cognitive map. So the cognitive map is your way, your abstraction that's that you used to try to approximate the world. So then there's a map, there is a model, and you use that to behave. So then, because you have a model, then your behavior might be more optimal relative to the behavior when you do not have a model-free. So model-based, model-free, habitual, goal-directed. So this is the literature, kind of. And if you're interested, then go to this paper. This is a very good review paper. So it has quite a few hundred references. It really summarizes most state-of-the-art by 2017 at least. Cool, next question. I feel happy about my explanation. Any other questions? Yeah, no? Okay, ready for the presentations? Nice. So before we do it, let me just briefly remind you, this is a paired presentation. 2 people will present the same paper, and you receive it in advance. And today you will also receive paper for the next week. I should have done that earlier. Wait. Yeah, I will send you an email. So the order will be decided. So I send you the randomized list. So you all know who will be working with whom, and which week you are about to present something. So the presentation is 15 minutes in pair, and you decide how you want to coordinate. And the topic is, so what is paper about? So what is the research question? What are the hypotheses? What is done? So what is the method? Human or animal? And what are the people, patients or healthy? And what are the methods, fMRI or EEG or eye tracking or whatever, neural imaging related techniques, methods, and experimental design? What is the task? What the participants are supposed to do? What is the problem that they represent? What's the choice they have to choose from, right? So those are the task related part. And what are the findings? So given this design, what are the data, what analysis they have done, and from this analysis, what conclusion they have drawn. And then that's the paper part. And then I asked you to be critical when reading the paper and when also preparing for the presentation. So you can just be critical in the sense that you can ask, well, do the data support that conclusion? And if you were about to do this experiment, no, because some paper they are from a few years ago. So what can be done a little bit differently? Or it can also be that what can be future direction. So from that paper, without really going to the literature, what's in your mind can be the next step to further understand decision making, to further understand the brain related to decision making. What can be improved? So what can be answered, right? Future direction can also be an interesting point. For those of you, if you do not have you do today, the presenters, if you do not do this future direction part, don't worry. But from the next week on, it will be great if the presenters could also prepare something like future direction. Cool. And then some questions and answers. So I think I spent too long. So yeah, let's move around. Yeah, everyone have a chance to do it. Good. Cool. All right. So now I will stop the recording.